Welcome to BlackFiles TV. This channel is dedicated to the examination of real criminal cases, not through myth, exaggeration, or spectacle, but through evidence, historical context, and critical analysis. Here, we do not glorify violence. We do not romanticize killers. We document what happened. We question what was assumed, and we learn from what was misunderstood. Every case we examine is treated as a file, a record of decisions, failures, blind spots, and consequences. In each episode, we reopen that file. We analyze the facts as they were known at the time. We examine the evidence that guided investigators and the evidence that misled them. We separate what can be proven from what was invented by rumor, media, and fear. This is episode 2 today. We are examining one of the most infamous criminal investigations in history, the Richard Ramirez case. Before we begin, if you value evidence over sensationalism and analysis over speculation, like this video and subscribe to BlackFiles TV. New case files are released regularly, and in the comments below, tell us which case you believe deserves to be reopened next. Now let's open the file. In the mid-1980s, Southern California slept differently. Windows that once stayed open were shut tight. Lights stayed on. Families checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times, before going to bed. Because somewhere in the darkness, an offender was moving without a pattern anyone could recognize. Different cities, different victims, different methods. The media would give him a name, but names can distort reality. Tonight, we strip away the mythology and examine the evidence, the timeline, and the systemic failures that allowed one man to terrorize an entire region. This is the BlackFiles case file on Richard Ramirez. Richard Leyva Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood environment was unstable, violent, and unpredictable. Multiple head injuries were reported during his early years, some from accidents, others from physical abuse. Medical attention was minimal. Psychological follow-up was non-existent. Inside the home, anger and fear were normalized. But one influence would stand out above the rest. Ramirez's older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran, shared graphic stories of combat violence. He showed young Richard photographs, images of mutilation, death, and brutality. For a developing mind already shaped by chaos, these images did not shock. They fascinated. By adolescence, Ramirez displayed clear warning signs: chronic substance abuse, social withdrawal, obsession with violent imagery, petty crime, and voyeurism. None of these resulted in structured intervention. The trajectory was already set. By his late teens, Ramirez had abandoned any stable structure. He drifted between Texas and California. He supported himself through burglary and drug use. These crimes were not random. They were rehearsals, breaking into homes, learning layouts, testing entry points, understanding how people slept. Law enforcement encounters during this period were brief and fragmented. Minor arrests, short jail stays, no long-term supervision. Each release reinforced a pattern. Consequences were temporary. Escalation was inevitable. The first confirmed murder attributed to Ramirez occurred in 1984. From the beginning, investigators struggled. Victims ranged widely in age, from children to the elderly. Some were sexually assaulted, some were shot, others were stabbed, beaten, or strangled. Crime scenes looked unrelated. Different weapons, different levels of violence, different neighborhoods. At the time, this variability suggested multiple offenders, but in hindsight, it was the signature. Ramirez selected opportunity, not victim type. Unlocked doors, open windows, isolated residences. The randomness was deliberate. By 1985, Southern California was operating under collective anxiety. The press coined the term the Night Stalker. Headlines were relentless. Nightly news detailed attack locations, weapons used, and victim behavior. The intent was public safety. The effect was mixed. While citizens became more vigilant, the offender was also watching. Ramirez followed media coverage closely. When details were broadcast, he adapted, changed weapons, altered entry methods, shifted neighborhoods. This feedback loop, media to offender, extended the spree. Fear became part of the environment. Multiple police departments were involved across counties. Information sharing was slow. Databases were limited. Patterns emerged, but late. Shoe impressions appeared at several scenes. A distinctive Avia sneaker tread. Ballistics linked firearms. Fingerprints were recovered. The problem was not evidence. It was integration. Each delay created another opportunity. This case would later become a textbook example of why centralized task forces matter. Eventually, fingerprint evidence was processed through improved systems. A match was returned. The name Richard Ramirez. Investigators now had an identity, but not a location. Ramirez had already fled Los Angeles. The decision was made to release his photograph to the public. This shifted the investigation dramatically. The perimeter expanded beyond law enforcement. In August 1985, Ramirez was recognized in East Los Angeles. A store owner noticed the face from the news. Ramirez ran. The public pursued. What followed was chaotic, uncontrolled, and dangerous. Residents restrained him until police arrived. For the first time, the offender who moved in shadows was fully visible. The night ended in daylight. Ramirez's trial began in 1988. It became one of the most expensive criminal trials in California history. Ramirez showed no remorse. He embraced the attention, smiled for cameras, played into the persona created by media coverage. But theatrics could not outweigh evidence. In 1989, he was convicted of 13 counts of murder, multiple sexual assaults, and numerous burglary charges. He was sentenced to death. Ramirez remained on death row for decades. He was never executed. In 2013, he died from complications related to illness while in custody. For many victims' families, closure remained incomplete. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is altered. The Richard Ramirez case is not just about violence. It is about systems under stress, media responsibility, interagency communication, early warning signs ignored. This case reshaped how serial crimes are investigated and shared, not through fear, but through structure. Some files close with arrests, others close with lessons. This one leaves both. What made this case particularly significant was the way it exposed vulnerabilities in how law enforcement agencies communicated across jurisdictions. The fragmented response allowed Ramirez to operate longer than he might have otherwise. Each department had pieces of the puzzle, but no mechanism existed to assemble them quickly. The shoe print evidence sat in one jurisdiction, while ballistics sat in another. Fingerprints waited in processing queues. Witnesses reported suspicious activity that never reached the right investigators. The delays were systemic, not individual failures. The media's role in this case remains debated. On one hand, widespread coverage eventually led to Ramirez's identification and capture. Citizens recognized him because his face had been broadcast repeatedly. But that same coverage may have extended the terror. Ramirez consumed news reports obsessively. He knew what police knew. He understood which neighborhoods were on high alert. He adjusted his methods based on what was being reported. This created an unusual dynamic, where public information became tactical intelligence for the offender. The psychological profile of Ramirez reveals a pattern seen in other cases, but rarely this pronounced. His complete lack of victim preference made traditional profiling difficult. Most offenders demonstrate clear patterns in victim selection, whether by age, gender, appearance, or location. Ramirez broke this pattern entirely. His only consistent factor was opportunity. This randomness was itself a pattern, one that investigators eventually recognized. But recognition came late. The childhood trauma and exposure to violence that shaped Ramirez are well documented. However, trauma alone does not create violent offenders. Millions of people experience difficult childhoods without becoming criminals. What distinguishes cases like Ramirez is the combination of factors: early head trauma affecting impulse control, exposure to graphic violence during critical developmental periods, lack of intervention when warning signs appeared, and an environment that normalized aggression. Each factor alone might be manageable. Together, they created conditions for escalation. The legal proceedings that followed Ramirez's capture were lengthy and complex. Multiple jurisdictions sought to prosecute. Victim families wanted justice. Defense attorneys argued procedural issues. The trial consumed years and significant resources. Throughout it all, Ramirez performed for cameras, creating a public persona that distorted the reality of his crimes. This behavior is not uncommon among offenders who receive intense media attention. The spectacle can overshadow the substance. When Ramirez died in 2013, he had spent nearly 3 decades on death row. California's death penalty process involves extensive appeals, often lasting decades. Some argue this delay denies justice. Others see it as necessary protection against wrongful execution. What is clear is that prolonged uncertainty affects victim families profoundly. Closure becomes complicated when legal processes extend for generations. The lessons from this case have influenced how serial crimes are now investigated. Multi-agency task forces became standard practice. Database systems improved to allow real-time information sharing. Forensic evidence processing received increased resources and priority. Media relations protocols were developed to balance public safety with operational security. These changes did not emerge from theoretical discussion. They came from analyzing what failed in cases like this one. Understanding this case requires looking beyond the individual crimes to the systems that surrounded them: law enforcement structure, media practices, public response, psychological development, legal processes. Each element played a role in how events unfolded. Each element offers lessons for preventing future cases. If you value evidence over myth, analysis over spectacle, subscribe to BlackFiles TV. New case files released weekly. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative. This is BlackFiles TV. This concludes today's case file. What we examined was not merely a crime, but the sequence of decisions, failures, and assumptions that ultimately shaped its outcome. Some case files remain open, not because the truth is unknowable, but because it was never fully pursued. Others are closed without justice, their conclusions shaped by limitations, errors, or narratives that replaced evidence. Yet every case leaves behind something of value: lessons about systems, accountability, and the consequences of what is overlooked or misunderstood. If you believe evidence should outweigh myth and analysis should come before speculation, consider subscribing to BlackFiles TV. Here we examine criminal cases with focus, restraint, and respect, documenting facts, questioning conclusions, and separating history from legend. New case files are released weekly. Until next time, continue to question the narrative. This is BlackFiles TV.